What if your ancestry was archived, not in your blood, but in a filing cabinet? What if the language your grandmother whispered in, the spices she ground, the songs she sang, all of it, was rebranded by a state that didn't know where to place you? Today, nearly half of Israel's Jews are labeled Mizrahi. Eastern, the word claims. A neat direction, a box to check. But step closer, and that label starts to blur. Because many of these so-called Easterners, they come from the West, from the Maghreb, from cities like Fez, Tunis, Tripoli. Not the deserts of Arabia, but the mountains of Morocco. Not from some mythical Orient, but from lands where Jewish bones have slept for over 2,000 years. And here's the twist. There's no ancient tribe of Mizrahim. No ancient scroll ever mentioned them. No kingdom rose under that name. This wasn't a family. It was a form. A term born not in ritual, but in bureaucracy. It didn't rise from synagogues. It rose from state lists, drawn by European Zionists trying to unify a nation torn between Yiddish and Arabic, between exile and return. Mizrahi wasn't a people. It was a category, a convenience. But try telling that to the woman in Beersheba who still cooks her grandmother's psaisa in silence, or to the child in Ashdod whose lullabies echo Judeo-Persian poems, or to the Iraqi elder who was taught the Talmud in a tongue older than the Hebrew revival. These aren't just Jews from the East. They're living testaments to vanished empires, survivors of Babylonia, Persia, Himyar. They carry bloodlines that predate Christianity, rituals that outlive caliphates. And yet, on paper, they're one group, Mizrahi. So now, ask yourself, if the category is modern, what was buried beneath it? What ancient identity was blurred, folded, and forgotten, just to make space on a government form? Because before the label, there was Babylon. And in Babylon, a different story begins. It didn't start in Poland, or Spain, or even Jerusalem. It started in exile, not by choice, but by chains. A people dragged from their homeland, their temple in ruins, their language cracked with grief. And yet they didn't disappear. They transformed. In the dust of Mesopotamia, between the slow-breathing rivers of Tigris and Euphrates, something impossible happened. Jewish law wasn't just preserved, it was rewritten, reimagined, reborn. Pumbedita, Surah, names that today feel foreign, but once echoed like thunder through the Jewish world. These weren't just towns. They were galaxies. Galaxies of thought, argument, memory. Pages written by candlelight across centuries. This was Babylon. Not just the empire that destroyed, but the land where something new was created. And here's where science whispers the memory. Even now, in the blood of Iraqi Jews, we find the echo. Genetic markers untouched by time, passed from generation to generation like sacred scrolls. DNA that remembers the academies, the rituals, the chants. It's all still there, hidden in cheek swabs and mitochondrial strands. A lineage not of myth, but of math. Imagine it. Your great-great-grandfather's prayers shaped in Babylon, and your cells still carry the proof. And yet, while Babylon built one pillar of Jewish survival, just across the mountains, another story was unfolding. A parallel world, where Hebrew met Zoroastrian myth, where Torah was retold in the style of Persian epic. Because exile didn't end in Babylon. It traveled further, to the land of fire and roses, Persia. And there, Jewish identity would mutate again. Not just survive, but become something astonishing. What happens when your sacred texts are torn from the land that birthed them and dropped into a world of fire temples and silk poems? You don't just translate them, you transform them. In the shadow of Persepolis, a quiet revolution began. Torah stories, the Exodus, the flood, the prophets, retold not as legal codes, but as epics. Rhymed, heroic, Persian, like the Shahnameh, but written in Hebrew script and sung by exiles. This wasn't adaptation, it was survival, disguised as art. The Jews of Persia didn't just memorize, they rewrote. Their Bibles became scrolls of Persian verse, where Moses moved like Rostam, and God's voice thundered like Ahura Mazda. And the language? A miracle on parchment. Hebrew letters shaped into Persian syntax, a linguistic chimera. You'd read a line and not know. Was it prophecy or poetry? It was both. Because when memory is all you have, you fold it into the rhythms of a land around you. Even today, in hidden corners of Iranian synagogues and diaspora living rooms in Los Angeles, you'll hear echoes of those verses, in the way blessings are recited, in melodies stretched across centuries, in the hush before a prayer begins. And then there's the spring onions, passed hand to hand at Passover, then used to strike each other, gently, playfully, almost ritually, not as punishment, as memory. Each lash, a whisper, we were there. We remember. Pharaoh's whip, in vegetable form, laughter and trauma braided into one, because identity doesn't survive through stone. It survives through song, through gesture, through food, through a whip made soft. But even this wasn't the end. Further south, beyond Persia's edge, in a land of sand and silence, another community had already been waiting. Older than Babylon, quieter than Persia, a people who claimed they never left the Holy Land because they'd never needed to return. And in Yemen, the echoes were even stranger. In the dry silence of Yemen's highlands, they still speak like the priests of Jerusalem once did. Not just similar, almost identical. The twist of the tongue, the breath between syllables, the ancient Hebrew, not revived, not reconstructed, preserved. While the world changed, while temples fell, while empires redrew the map, Yemenite Jews whispered the Torah in a dialect that time forgot to erase. But how? Some say they came with Solomon's traders, sent south for incense and gold. Others, that they fled after Rome crushed Judea, carrying only scrolls, salt, and secrets. Whatever the truth, they stayed, hidden in valleys where sand meets stone, far from Babylon, far from Persia, far enough to remain untouched. And in that isolation, something extraordinary happened. Their keraset, called dukkha, still bears the name linked to the temple days. A thick paste of dates, spices, memory. Their bsisa, their henna, their firelight songs, not recreated, remembered. Their weddings still shimmer with silver threads and chanting rhythms that don't belong to this century. And then there's the sound. Listen to their Torah reading, and you don't just hear Hebrew. You hear Makamat, modal scales that echo pre-Islamic Arab music. Scales not taught, but transmitted, as if the very air remembered. And yet, in blood, too, they are distinct. Genetically, Yemenite Jews form a cluster almost untouched by time, a fingerprint frozen in desert wind, neither European nor fully Middle Eastern, a line all their own. So who were they, really? Not Eastern, not Sephardic, not exilic in the usual sense. Maybe, just maybe, they weren't waiting for a Messiah to return them to Jerusalem, because in every note they sang, every word they spoke, Jerusalem had never left. But while Yemen guarded memory in silence somewhere else, a secret was being inked in Cairo, a scroll buried for centuries, and when it was found, it would connect these distant worlds like never before. They found it by accident, tucked behind a crumbling wall in a Cairo synagogue, a sealed chamber, never meant to be opened. Inside, 500,000 fragments, not scrolls, not sacred texts, letters, shopping lists, marriage contracts, poems, complaints, sermons, even a note about a missing goat, everyday breathings of a world no one thought survived. This was the Cairo Genizah, 1,000 years of Jewish life, hidden in dust, not buried in earth. And what it revealed shattered everything we thought we knew. Because here, in Judeo-Arabic script, not Hebrew, not Yiddish, Jews from Morocco, Iraq, Persia, Yemen, even India, were speaking to each other, trading, debating, mourning, loving. Centuries before the word Mizrahi was even born, they were already connected. Letters from a merchant in Fustat to his brother in Basra, recipes scribbled beside theological debates, a worn page carrying a woman's song from Tunis to Baghdad. This wasn't diaspora. This was network, a civilization built in the shadows, legally tolerated, religiously marginalized, but intellectually crucial. These Jews, marked as Demis, second class, walked with heads lowered, but in the silence of their homes, they preserved something vast, translated Plato, commented on Aristotle, protected the very philosophy that the empires above them would one day claim as their own. And still, they wrote in Judeo-Arabic, Hebrew letters, Arabic grammar, a language of in-between, because that's where they lived. Not east, not west, not ruler, not rebel, but bridges, between empires, between centuries. And that bridge was about to tremble, because while these voices flowed through paper and ink, further west, in Al-Andalus, another Jewish golden age was rising, until a new empire came, one that didn't want letters, or networks, or bridges. It wanted silence, oblivion, and it almost got it. At first, it looked like paradise. Jews rising to power in the courts of Cordoba, philosophers debating under moonlit arches, Hebrew poetry flowing in Arabic meter. Al-Andalus, where you could be a Jew and still walk among kings. But history always plays its music in minor keys, because just beneath the splendor, the shadow was growing. Maimonides was only a boy when the Almohads came, preachers with swords, tolerance replaced by doctrine, the synagogues that once sang silenced, the rabbis hunted, Jews given a choice, convert, flee, or vanish. Maimonides fled, disguised, shifting cities like sand. He wrote in Arabic, but with Jewish fire, guide for the perplexed, a masterpiece smuggled between worlds, not to survive, but to anchor a faith cracking under exile. And yet, it wasn't just faith that lived on. Jewish scribes in Spain translated Aristotle, preserved Galen, rescued Plato, not for their people, for the world. They were the quiet relay between lost Greek and rising Europe, between Islamic intellect and Latin rediscovery. Without them, no Renaissance, no science as we know it. And still they couldn't stay. The same cities that crowned them turned to ash. What began as golden ended in forced silence, in buried books, in vanished names. But the story doesn't end in Spain, because across the sea, in the mountains of the Maghreb, another legend was stirring. She didn't wear a scholar's robe. She wore armor, carried a blade, and her name would terrify conquerors. She rode into battle with prophecy in her blood and vengeance in her eyes. They called her Kahena, a queen, a warrior, a priestess, or maybe just a myth. But for centuries, mothers in North Africa whispered her name like a spell, Al-Kahena, the one who stood when everyone else fled. She ruled the Oras Mountains with an iron hand and a cracked heart. Her people were Berbers, mountain tribes woven from earth and fire. Some say she was Jewish, others say pagan. Some call her a nationalist, centuries before the concept was born. No one agrees. Which, of course, is exactly why she matters. Because Kahena defied the Arab conquest, faced down the wave of empire with a blade, a kingdom, and the unbroken will of a people that refused to vanish. She burned her own cities to slow their advance, told her sons to convert, to survive, told her warriors to fight, to remember. And somewhere in that desert smoke, Jewish tradition and Berber soul collided, not peacefully, but permanently. Tribes converted, songs merged, laws bent, rituals changed shape. A Torah scroll might sit beside a goat's skull. Hebrew blessings, spoken in Amazigh cadence. And still today, her story is pulled like a rope in opposite directions. Israeli historians see a rebel queen of Jewish pride. Arab scholars call her a fabrication, or worse, a tool. But neither version feels complete. Because Kahena isn't just history, she's identity under siege. She's what happens when you're too Jewish for the conqueror, and too indigenous for the archive. She's what's left behind when memory survives through myth. But memory didn't stay in legend. Because in the 20th century, with one war, one border shift, one mass expulsion, entire communities like hers were scattered. The Berber-Jewish fusion that had lasted centuries was nearly erased overnight. And what followed wasn't myth. It was exile at scale. The year was 1948. For some, it was birth. For others, it was collapse. Across Cairo, Baghdad, Aleppo, Fez, the smoke came first. Then the silence. Over 850,000 Jews, torn from the only homes they'd ever known. Centuries-old synagogues emptied overnight. Scrolls burned. Doors locked. Keys, still hidden in pockets. 3 generations later. They didn't leave with honor. They left with one suitcase. Sometimes less. And when they arrived in Israel, battered, heartbroken, fluent in Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Persian, Bukhari, Judo-Tat, the state gave them a single word, Mizrahi. One word, one box. For dozens of cultures, hundreds of dialects, thousands of years. A Persian rabbi and a Tunisian merchant, now the same. A Babylonian Torah scholar and a Berber silversmith, folded into one invented identity. Because in the new map of Zion, identity had to be clean. Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, never Yemeni and royal, never Iraqi and philosopher, never Moroccan and mystic. In the refugee camps, the Mahabharat, the dialects faded. Children stopped singing in Judeo-Arabic. Mothers were told to stop cooking Arab food. Fathers were told to forget the names of their cities. It wasn't just exile. It was reformatting, from living history to a demographic code. But something resisted. In the back streets of Jerusalem, in the housing blocks of Beersheba, in the cracked courtyards of development towns, a whisper turned into rhythm, then rhythm into chant, then chant into revolution, because the label couldn't contain them. And out of the margins came fire. It started with broken windows in Haifa, Wadi Salib, a neighborhood that had once been Arab, now filled with Jews from Morocco, forgotten by the government that brought them here. In 1959, a single gunshot lit the match. A Mizrahi man, unarmed, was shot by police. And suddenly, the silence cracked. They marched. They shouted, not in Hebrew, but in pain. We are Jews too. We fought in your wars. We buried our past, and you buried our future. But no one listened, until the children grew up. In the 70s, they called themselves the Black Panthers. Young Mizrahim from Masrara, standing in alleys still wrapped in trauma, demanding justice, dignity, and memory. They weren't burning the flag. They were asking why it had never been theirs. Why their mothers scrubbed floors, while Ashkenazi elites debated literature. Why their fathers, engineers in Baghdad, now swept construction sites. They wore leather jackets, marched through the streets, faced the cameras head-on, and behind them, a slow cultural uprising. Yemenite chants started leaking into mainstream music. Mamauna, once mocked, became a national celebration. Moroccan spices flavored Israeli kitchens. Persian rugs returned to synagogue floors. And then came Avadia. Rabbi Avadia Yosef, soft-spoken, steel-willed, changed everything. He declared Mizrahi halakha not a second-tier tradition, but a pillar of Jewish law. He didn't ask for permission. He restored what exile had fractured. But the scars remained, because for every Mamauna in Tel Aviv, there's still a name mispronounced, a dialect dismissed, a grandfather's story left untold. And so, even now, in a country built to end exile, the question lingers in the back of every Mizrahi throat. Are we Jews of the East? Arabs who are also Jews? Or something the world hasn't named yet? And as identity twists through memory, science offers its own answer. In strands of DNA, buried deep, the body remembers truths that history tries to forget. The tests were supposed to give clarity. Cheek swab, saliva tube, a report in your inbox. But when scientists mapped the genomes of Middle Eastern Jews, what they found didn't match the map on paper. Because Iraqi, Persian, Syrian, Moroccan Jews, scattered by empire, silence, and state policy, still clustered tightly, genetically, as if exile had never truly splintered them. And yet, there was a glitch in the pattern. Yemenite Jews. Their DNA stood apart. Not far, but skewed. Closer, oddly, to the populations of the Arabian Peninsula than to their fellow Jews across the sea. A mystery buried in mitochondrial whispers. Some saw this as evidence of ancient trade routes. Others, of deeper, pre-exilic roots. A community that didn't return to Jerusalem because they never left. But here's the real question. Can DNA tell us who we are? Or only what we're made of? Because culture, memory, doesn't fit in a helix. How do you map a wedding song in Judeo-Arabic? Or the scent of coriander steaming through a Sabbath stew? How do you sequence the rhythm of a Yemenite chant, passed from father to daughter, over open fire? This isn't a family tree. It's a mosaic. And each shard tells a story that refuses to conform. One genome says Babylon. Another hums with the cadence of Shiraz. A third still carries the lullabies of Marrakesh. Not one root, but a field of roots, burned, buried, then reborn in strange soil. So maybe the question isn't where did we come from? Maybe it's what survived the burning. Because even now, in Brooklyn, in Tel Aviv, in Paris, Mizrahi weddings still echo with ancient vowels. Grandmothers still bless with henna, not Hebrew. And Torah scrolls still sleep in silver ticks. But something is shifting. Mizrahi culture, once silenced, is now a trend. On stages, in nightclubs, repackaged, remixed. And as it spreads, another question rises. When the whole world dances to your melody, what happens to the silence behind it? They were never waiting to be rescued. Because Mizrahi Jews didn't arrive in Israel as empty vessels. They arrived with entire civilizations in their suitcases. Recipes older than borders. Languages older than flags. Melodies tuned to the frequency of exile and endurance. They came with memory carved into bone. And while the state tried to label them, they just kept living. Now look again. A Persian Torah scroll glows beneath fluorescent lights in a Brooklyn basement. A henna ceremony unfolds on a Tel Aviv rooftop, not as revival, but continuation. And somewhere in Queens, a teenage boy spits Judeo-tat bars over trap beats, his grandmother's vowels writing his bass lines. This isn't nostalgia. It's survival disguised as art, because the Mizrahi story was never about return. It was about resistance, not by fighting, by remembering, even when their dialects were mocked, their rituals dismissed, their names mispronounced. They whispered in kitchens, wrote in margins, danced in rooms too small for ceremony. And now, those whispers have become signals. Signals that say, we were never just Eastern, never just Arab, never just Jewish. We were all of it, at once. So what if the future of Judaism isn't born in the center, but at the edge? What if it speaks in borrowed accents and sings in forgotten scales? What if it lives not in clean categories, but in the mess of real lives, fused by survival? Because sometimes it's not the language that carries the truth, it's the blood. And sometimes the blood remembers what the tongue was forced to forget. In our next story, we follow that memory east, to the Malabar coast, to Cochin, to the Jews of India, whose DNA may hold an even stranger secret.